Okay, everybody, let's get started. It is my big pleasure to introduce Ed Dlugokencky as our seminar speaker today. Ed is good friend and colleague to many of us here at ACD, not only because he spent a year also here at ACD in the past. I don't know which year that was, but 1989, but also because many of us work actually closely together with Ed. Ed is with the NOAA ESRL, with the Global Monitoring Division, and let me look at my cheat sheet. Ed did his undergrad in chemistry at the UC San Diego, did then his PhD here at CU, and he actually has been at NOAA since 1990, and I probably don't exaggerate if I say that he's definitely one of the leading experts in regard to methane. And I mean, methane is really in everybody's interest nowadays. And today he's going to talk to us about the observational constraints on the global methane budget. Thanks a lot, Ed.
All right, thank you, Gabby, and thanks to all of you for coming. So like Gabby said, I'm going to talk about what our measurements tell us about the global methane budget. And before I start, I have to acknowledge my colleagues in the carbon cycle group at GMD. Certainly not one person could make these 20,000 measurements of methane a year. There's like a whole team of people involved in collecting the samples, getting them analyzed, doing quality control on the data, and then also analyzing the data. So methane, as you know, has a direct influence on climate through its through its absorption of thermal infrared radiation. It contributes about ½ a watt per meter squared to total long-lived radiative forcing by long-lived greenhouse gases. It also has some indirect effects through its atmospheric chemistry, producing tropospheric ozone and stratospheric water vapor. That adds approximately another 0.2 watts per meter squared to its radiative forcing. And then you see methane a lot in the news these days because there's a potential for some strong feedbacks in the Arctic that involve methane. In fact, probably about a third of the presentation, I'll talk about a recent increase in methane that started in 2007, which in part has a connection with the Arctic, but it's not as bad as a lot of people are making it out to be. I like studying methane because the budget is very complicated. There are a number of different sources. Emissions are relatively weak, distributed over large areas, which makes them difficult to quantify from the top down. It also makes it so you can say just about anything you want about what's happening, and then there's going to be an element of truth to it. So just as a brief outline, I'll tell you what I'm going to talk about. First, I'll tell you a little bit about the global methane budget for those of you that aren't aware what the major sources and sinks are. Then, since we're a monitoring laboratory, I want to talk a bit about the data, about the sampling and the measurements and the quality control on the data, because I think this is the most important aspect of what NOAA brings to this. And then when we start looking at zonally averaged and globally averaged data, I'm going to break it down in a couple different ways. First, start looking at what long-term trends are telling us about the global methane budget. Then look at anomalies in methane growth rate, and then talk about, focus on two different things. One is the impact of the eruption of Mount Pinatubo on atmospheric methane, and also the economic collapse of the former Soviet Union, because that still has pertinence in looking at things that are happening in the Arctic today. And then I'll talk about recent changes in the atmospheric burden of methane and the potential for climate feedbacks in the Arctic. So just quickly, here's a global methane budget, and ignore all the stuff, the numbers on the right-hand side of the plot. This is just to give you an idea of what the different source terms are. And for anthropogenic sources, the largest terms are energy, production, coal, oil, and natural gas, and enteric fermentation, cow farts, in other words. But it's mostly not farting, but belching from cattle and sheep. And then smaller amounts from rice agriculture, biomass burning, and waste processing like landfills and liquid waste as well. And then in terms of the natural sources, the big one is wetlands. It's about 150 teragrams per year. And this is out of a total budget of about 525 to 550 teragrams per year. And the main sinks, as you know, are mostly reaction with hydroxyl radical in the troposphere and the stratosphere and a small soil sink. And the other thing I can point out here, this being a budget from Bousquet et al. In 2006, you know, lots of people have lots of different budgets. None is really any better than another. But you notice that the emissions and the losses are nearly in balance. And that's why we see this large variability in the methane growth rate that we do observe. So a little bit about our sampling and measurements. We have a number of different programs in the carbon cycle group, but the one I'm going to focus on is what's described here as surface discrete samples. These are air samples collected about weekly in pairs in 2.5-liter glass flasks with a portable sampling system. And they return to our lab in Boulder where they're checked in, information put in the database, and then they're analyzed by GC with flame ionization detection. We try to make the measurements as precisely as possible. The repeatability of our measurements on the order of 1 ppb, which is one part in 1800, something like that, which is pretty good. The other thing is that since our measurement program started in 1983, we've been maintaining our own standard scales. And we believe that our standard scale is internally consistent over this entire period for 30 years now to plus or minus 1 ppb, you know, at a 1 sigma confidence level. The network itself is really very cooperative in nature. We have participation from a broad spectrum of people, from private citizens, you know, living on a farm in Utah, to people in other organizations like NOAA that operate observatories around the world, and in other cases, you know, it'd be like the National Weather Service or military bases or things like that. As it turns out, other government, U.S. government employees are the worst sample collectors that we have, particularly like the National Weather Service. But, so from this network, we get about 10,000 samples per year that we analyze. And then from one of the other networks, basically two of the other networks, tall towers and vertical profile sampling from light aircraft, we get an additional about 10,000 samples per year. And these are all analyzed on one of two systems in Boulder, giving the entire measurement network a great degree of internal consistency. Okay, so in red are the data that I'm going to talk about here. These blue crosses are part of our vertical profiling program, and the green triangles are our tall tower program. And we use a little bit different system for sampling there. We use a 12-pack sampler. It's basically a suitcase that has 12 samples in it. It's coupled with a compressor package, and you can program it to collect samples at various altitudes, or in the case of the tall towers, to collect a sample a day or once every 2 days or something like that. No one has to go out and interact with it. With the samples collected at the site shown in red on here, somebody actually has to go out and collect the sample each time. So in addition to maintaining this standard scale very carefully over all these decades, we have a number of ways that we do quality control on the data. And one of them is in Boulder, we have some target tanks that we run on our analysis systems frequently. I'm not going to show you the results of those, but I'm going to show you another type of quality control we do, and this is a contribution we make to the World Meteorological Organization Global Atmosphere Watch program, and that is we partner with various labs to try to make sure all the labs within the network are making measurements that are compatible. And I've chosen to show you two types of comparisons we have with Environment Canada. And this is at their site in Alert, which is the northernmost site we have in our network. They operate an observatory there, collect our weekly samples, and send them back. So one of the comparisons we do is from the same flask that we're going to analyze. First, Environment Canada takes a little sniff out of the flask and measures it for methane and a number of other species too. And the results, ours in blue and Environment Canada in red, are shown there. But more importantly, the differences are shown here in green. Now, the WMO Global Atmosphere Watch recommended compatibility among networks is plus or minus 2 ppb. And you can see that on measurements from the same flask, virtually, or most of the samples lie within that plus or minus 2 ppb band. Another type of comparison we do is comparing our flask measurement with a continuous measurement made by Environment Canada at alert. And that's shown in the top panel here, and the difference is here. You see, oh, all of a sudden it doesn't look quite as good. You notice the scale here is minus 15 to plus 15 instead of minus 6 to plus 6. And there are some periods where we fall outside this plus or minus 2 ppb agreement criteria by WMO GA. In most cases, this turns out to be a misassigned value for a cylinder used at the in situ site. Now, we do the same thing with our measurements at Mauna Loa and Barrow. We compare flash measurements with hourly average measurements from our continuum analyzers, and we get results probably a little bit better than this, but not that much. It's one main advantage to having discrete samples brought back to a central laboratory. It gives you this great internal consistency. It's much easier to maintain standards in a lab here in Boulder than it is in the field, like in Alaska or Alert or wherever. So here's an example of the data. This is from our site in Barrow, Alaska, on the North Slope of Alaska. And here's the methane dry air mole fraction as a function of time starting in 1983 through to the latest data that we have in 2013. The data are scrutinized here in Boulder to make sure there weren't any experimental problems either during analysis or sampling. And then also they're looked at to determine if it's really a background sample. All the sites in that network, we want well-mixed air representative of a large volume of the atmosphere. And the appropriate flags are assigned. They're shown in green and blue. I know the green's a bit hard to see in this case. And what's left, the retained values, the ones that we use for analysis, are shown in red here. And to smooth the data, we do that a couple of different ways. In blue is a deseasonalized trend curve. In essence, we're filtering the data and removing variations with periods of a year or less. That's shown in blue. And then in green, we're doing the same thing, but now we're only removing the very high frequency variations. So basically with a period of about 40 days or less. And still, there's quite a bit of variability in this. And I just want to point out that the variability in here is real variability at Barrow. It's not measurement noise. So, you know, from week to week, we can see changes of 40 ppb at Barrow depending on the trajectory of the air mass that we're sampling. Okay, so here's data from one site. We have this whole network of sites, and somehow we want to combine those data in some useful way that we can get zonal and global averages. And the way we do that is we start with curves like the green one that have been fitted to data from a subset of the sites there, the real background sites. We extract points at synchronized time intervals, and then we fit a curve as a function of latitude to that. Yeah? These are data that have been flagged. So in one case, all right, let's use the blue ones for example. This is a pair of samples right here. There's a large pair difference, and you can see it's also much lower than ambient. So we can tell by looking at methane and a number of other species that what happened here was when the sample collector went out to collect the samples, they didn't flush the flask thoroughly. So we're left with something like that. In other cases, we can use statistical techniques to flag what we call non-background data. In both cases, whether they're flagged with a hard flag like this or a soft flag like this, all the data are in the database. So if a user wants to use the green points here, trying to look at what's happening locally at Barrow, because in many cases what's happened is these samples are contaminated by local emissions. If they want to use those data, they can. So we don't hide anything from the data when we make the data available. So after we fit those curves to the different sampling sites and then do a separate fit as a function of latitude, we get a matrix of methane like this. This is methane along this axis, latitude along this axis, and time along here. I've started this in 2001, otherwise it gets a bit messy. And you can see all the main features in the global distribution of methane in this plot here, including the seasonal cycle. So when you're looking at this edge here, you're looking at basically what we're finding at South Pole and our other Antarctic sites. And you see the seasonal cycle with an amplitude of about 30 ppb. In the northern hemisphere, you also have a seasonal cycle. It's almost 180 degrees out of phase with the one in South Pole. And it has a larger amplitude because this is driven by OH in mid-latitudes of the southern hemisphere. But this one also has a component of seasonal emissions that makes the seasonal cycle larger. And the other big main feature you see in here is the strong gradient from north to south. That's an imprint of emissions on the data. That atmospheric mixing isn't large enough to completely homogenize what we're seeing. So from this matrix, then we can collapse that to calculate zonal means at hemispheric levels or global levels. Yes?
Sorry to straight up, are there two maximums?
Yes, that's true. There are at times we'll see, like say a fall maxima and then a spring one. Sometimes there'll be two maxima, one say in January, one in April, something like that. So I should have pointed out here that you can look at all of our most recent measurements at this website here. So everything that was analyzed up through last night will be available for plotting on this site here. You just click on a site on the map, and then you can plot the data and look at it. And we're not going to hide anything from you. Okay, so from that matrix we can calculate zonal and global averages. And here on the top panel I have got the globally average methane plotted as a function of time starting in 1983.5 through, in this case, about halfway through 2012. We don't have all the samples from 2012 yet. Some of them are still coming back from remote sites, so we can't really complete this till the end of the year yet. And as before, there are some curves fitted here. So the global averages are in blue, and then the red curve is the deseasonalized trend curve. And if you take the derivative of that with respect to time, you get the methane growth rate, which is shown here in red, with some estimate of the uncertainty, which is done with a Monte Carlo technique, a bootstrap technique, we call it. And over this nearly 30 years now, the main features we see in the data are this long-term decreasing growth rate, a flattening of the methane burden from about 1999 through 2006, and then a more recent increase here. So you can see the decline in growth rate here, but with lots of interannual variability superimposed on top of it, relatively flat through here, and then an increase there. Well, this decrease in growth rate, for those of you that have a kinetics background, looks like a chemical system approaching steady state, at least it did to me. And the equation that describes that is shown here. This is methane as a function of time, with these other terms in here, which is methane at steady state and the methane lifetime over there. And when you do a fit of this function to these data and solve for steady state methane and the methane lifetime, and I've only done this fit through 2006 before this big increase started again, I get a lifetime of 9.4 years and a steady state methane mixing ratio, global methane mixing ratio of 1796 ppb, so just under 1800 ppb. The accepted lifetime for methane is on the order of 9 years, plus or minus half a year. I mean, to me, this looks like an approach to steady state. There's another way to look at this that I'll show you in a moment. If you take the derivative of the green curve, you can see, and these derivatives are very, very sensitive to small changes. You can see how nicely, at least to the eye, it follows the actual observed growth rate here. So based on this, I'm thinking we have a chemical system that's approaching steady state. Now, if that were true, that would mean that over this period from 84 through 2006, that emissions would be constant. And so I actually can do that very simple calculation just with a mass balance that looks like this equation up here. So I'm calculating emissions from the observed rate of increase in the observed burden and an estimate of a lifetime from the literature. Well, at the time I first started doing this, the best estimate was 8.9 years, so I've continued using that. And the calculated emissions from this equation here and the data is shown in blue here. And if you fit it to the entire record, including the last 5 years of higher growth, we get this small slope of about 0.5, plus or minus 0.5 teragrams of methane per year. Remember, this was out of a total of about 550 or 560 teragrams per year. But if I fit it over only through 2006, I get the green line shown here and there's no trend at all. So what this tells me is emissions have been constant over the last, almost 30 years, except for these last 5 years, if we assume that the lifetime has been constant. And I think this decrease in growth rate is something that's confused a lot of people. They think for the growth rate to be decreasing, you have to have a decrease in emissions. But that's, I guess what I'm trying to show you is that's not necessarily the case. Okay, so that's the long-term picture, this approach to steady state. So now I wanted to look at some anomalies in methane that we've observed. And to do that, to find the anomalies, I'm going to fit a function that looks like this. It has a quadratic that approximates the long-term trend, and then some harmonics that approximate the average seasonal cycle. And that's shown, that fit to the data in red is shown in blue here. And if I take the difference, I get these residuals that I'm calling an anomaly that are shown in blue down here. And just for comparison with what I showed you last time, the growth rate, which would be in ppb per year, is shown in the red dotted line here. So there are two different types of anomalies here. There are these short-lived anomalies, like this one in 1991, one in 97, 98, and one in 2002 and 3 here. And then there are these sort of changes that happen that affect the long-term behavior of methane. And again, that's happened between around 91, 92 here, and then between 2006 and 2007 there. And the ones I'm going to talk about are what happened in 1991. The cause of this change here is the second one, and then from here onwards is the third one. Okay, so one way we can get other information about what's happening with methane is to take our great spatial coverage and calculate the growth rate as a function of latitude. And that's shown here as a growth rate contour plot. So the red colors are regions of high growth rate, and the cool colors are regions of lower growth rate. In 1991, here you see this bullseye right over the tropics, which is being propagated to high southern latitudes. And if we were to zoom in on this previous plot right here, we'd see that this residual here starts like right in the middle of 1991. And there's a residual in CO of about the same size right at the same time. And what we think this is the impact of the eruption of Pinatubo on photochemistry in the troposphere. And we actually published something about this a long time ago. For me, this was like a great collaboration between NOAA and NCAR, because you can see Sasha Madranic and Kathy Lance were also authors on this paper. And then my colleague Els Dutton, who passed away last October, too. When I first approached Els about doing some radiative transfer calculations and looking at the impact of these emissions on photochemistry in the troposphere, he was a little bit unsure of himself. And so with the help of Sasha and Kathy, we were able to do a very nice study, I think. So the eruption happened in mid-June. It injected about 20 megatons of SO2 into the upper troposphere and lower stratosphere, which over time was oxidized to sulfate. So the lifetime of the SO2 is on the order of a month, and the sulfate aerosol on the order of 6 months to a year. There was also about 3 to 5 cubic kilometers of ash injected into the atmosphere. We didn't include that in the calculation because really no one knew how to account for the optical properties of the ash. And the way this affects OH is by direct absorption of UV by SO2 and scattering by aerosols. And, well, I'm almost embarrassed to describe this photochemistry to people here at NCAR, but anyway, I will. As you know, OH is formed by first photolyzing ozone in this UV region to form this electronically excited oxygen atom. And then that reacts with water vapor to form OH. The rate of formation of O singlet D is just given by this photolysis constant times the ozone concentration. And in this case, what we did is we calculated changes in that production by looking at changes in the UV actinic flux here. And the result is shown here. So this is the change in the J ozone channel that produces O singlet D in percent. So you can see at the time of the eruption here at 0, we had an initially very large decrease of about 12% in this parameter. And then it slowly quickly initially decays and then more slowly. So this is the decay of the SO2 as it's converted to sulfate, and this is the decay of the aerosol over time. And as already mentioned, the impact of this on methane was also seen in CO. So this change in O singlet D formation, about 12%, it's not a 12% change in OH, as it turns out, because this is just the primary production of OH. There's some recycling of OH. You'd have to reduce this, multiply it by about 0.6 or 0.7, and you get about a 7 or 8% change in OH initially after the eruption. Okay, so now I wanted to move into this second anomaly, and that's this transition here where we go from an upward trend here to a downward trend like that. After the eruption of Pinatubo, there were a couple other perturbations. One was the aerosol resulted in cooling in the tropics, which could affect emissions from wetlands, which are very temperature sensitive. Another thing that happened is that there was a lot of stratospheric ozone destruction involving the heterogeneous chemistry in the sulfate aerosol, so that could have enhanced production of OH in the troposphere. And the third thing that happened around that time was the economic collapse of the former Soviet Union. And only one of these three could have a long-term effect like this. And we think what that was the collapse of the former Soviet Union and a decrease in methane emissions from anthropogenic sources like the fossil fuel sector and also from ruminant animals. And so as a proxy for fossil fuel emissions in the former Soviet Union, what I show here is production of the three main fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, that's normalized to 1990 levels. And you can see they're actually quite large, like 40% decreases in the early 1990s of oil and coal in the former Soviet Union, and about a 10% reduction in natural gas here. And inventories like EDGAR try to capture these reduced anthropogenic emissions in them. So do we have any sort of observational evidence that suggests that this really happened? And here I've used zonal averages, polar northern hemisphere, which is 53 to 90 north minus polar southern hemisphere, 53 to 90 south. That difference shown here. And you can see up until 1991, this difference, about 140 ppb, was trending upwards. And then after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and since then, it's been trending downwards. Now, we compared this result with a model result. This was done by Sander Howling. And he used the EDGAR inventory in this older model that no one uses anymore called TM3. And that's shown in red here. It actually matches the pattern that we observe in the observations reasonably well. But it looks like it underestimates the drop in interpolar difference. It could be that the change in emissions was just too small in EDGAR. I'm going to come back to this in a bit because it has implications for what we're trying to understand in the Arctic as well. So as a summary so far, what I'm trying to show you is that we have some high quality observations of methane that constrain the global methane budget, that the decreasing methane growth rate indicates an approach to steady state. If you assume that the lifetime's been constant, it means that emissions have been constant at least through 2006 too, that there's significant interannual variability in the rate of increase. Most of that is driven by more or less natural processes, I think. The eruption of Pinatubo affected OH, which affected methane and CO. We also see it in methylchloroform, but it's very, very small signal. And the economic collapse in the former Soviet Union observed the latitudinal gradient in methane. And as I said, this has implications for what I'll talk about next, and that's this increase that started again in 2007. So here we are in 2007, and we see methane increasing again. I've just zoomed in on 2000 through 2012 here, globally average methane again. And I'll just remind you that during this period here, methane was relatively constant. The increase from 99 to 2006 averaged 0.5 ppb per year, and since 2007 it's been more than an order of magnitude greater at 6 ppb per year. So we can look at these spatial patterns again and see what they're telling us. So this is that growth rate contour plot again, latitude here and time down here are the same time period we just looked at. And starting in 2007, you see two big signals, one here in the Arctic and another one in the southern tropics being propagated to the high latitudes of the southern hemisphere. And then since then, most of the action seems to be in the tropics, either side of the equator. This is a bit of a puzzle up here that we can't really explain yet. Okay, so I just want to sort of go through potential causes of this one by one, and I'll start with anthropogenic emissions. And so here I'm plotting normalized coal consumption globally in blue, and then China in purple, all of Asia in green, and Russia in red. These numbers in parentheses just show in 2011 what their contribution was to total global coal production. So China is about half now. And you can see that production of coal is just, at least since about 2000, has been ramping up in Asia quite rapidly. Globally, the change is more modest, but it's still on the order of about a 60% increase in global coal production since about 2000. So you might think, oh, maybe that's a contributor. But because these emissions from these anthropogenic sectors are going to change more gradually, I don't think it's what caused the abrupt change that started in 2007. Okay, then, because the sink is the biggest term in the global methane budget, maybe you think that the sink could have a contribution to it. And we have a number of different tracers that we can look at that can give us some, at least qualitative information about how the sink might be changing. At NOAA, we have methylchloroform measurements in the tropics. Steve Monska has done over the years a very nice analysis looking at the decay in methylchloroform. And you can tell from that variations in OH are relatively small. But for the period starting in 2007, we say, well, maybe the uncertainty in the change is rather large. Could have been anywhere from -2 to +1% change in OH. But two other traces, perchloroethylene from Isabel Simpson at UC Irvine, and our measurements of CO suggest that there wasn't a change in OH starting in 2007. So the next thing is, the next potential cause I wanted to look at was biomass burning. Remember, it was on the order of about 50 teragrams per year, but it's something that varies quite a bit from year to year. And here I'm looking at CO residuals. We also have a couple other tracers we can use to try to understand biomass burning emissions, including ethane and chloromethane. And so here, as I showed for methane before, but I'm also showing for CO, are residuals calculated with a fit to the data, a function fit to the data like we did before. Methane's in red. Measurements from the same samples that we measure methane are in blue. And then from Louisa Emmons, we have Moffett CO at 700 hectopascal average, zonally average for this polar northern region and the tropics here. And there is a hint in late 2006 and early 2007 that in the tropics there may have been a small contribution from biomass burning to what we're observing in methane. That's also supported by the ethane and the chloromethane observations, but we figure that it could only be on the order of 10% or so of the total anomaly in 2007. And you can see that since then, while the methane anomaly just keeps growing more positive like this, in the CO, we're basically just seeing noise from one year to the next. There hasn't really been a change in the trend in CO that would have been necessary for a significant change in biomass burning emissions over this entire period. So we don't think it's biomass burning. So you remember that tropical wetlands were, in terms of sources, the biggest source in the global methane budget, on the order of 150 teragrams of methane. And wetlands, two factors can contribute to changes in wetland emissions of methane. One would be the area of the wetlands or inundation, which is related to precipitation, and the other is temperature. Temperature is more of a factor in the Arctic than it is in tropical regions. So here I'm showing on the top panel in red are precipitation anomalies in tropical wetlands. So these precipitation anomalies come from this Global Precipitation Climatology project, and they've been selected specifically for grid cells where we have wetlands. And on the same plot, I also have the methane residuals or anomalies. And you can see in 2007, when we've switched from a long period of mostly negative precipitation anomalies to positive precipitation anomalies, we see that's when the methane, the big methane anomaly in 2007 starts. This pattern of these precipitation anomalies in the tropics have a strong correlation with ENSO, shown here in the bottom panel. So you can see in this period here where we have somewhat persistent La Nina starting in 2007 is when we have this string of positive precipitation anomalies there. Then we do have some observational evidence that suggests there was an increase in methane fluxes, at least in the Amazon during those years. So we have two sites in Brazil where we have vertical profiles collected. They're analyzed at our collaborators' lab in Brazil, and you can calculate fluxes from those using other information from the background network. And those fluxes for two periods, the dry period shown in red here, and for this wet period starting in 2007 and 2008 here. And you can see that the fluxes are, at least the seasonal fluxes are on average about 50% greater during the wet years than the dry years, and that's especially true during the middle part of the year. So there is some observational evidence that this may be happening. And I can also point out that an increase in tropical emissions is consistent with about a 0.4 per mil decrease in delta C13 of methane that our collaborators at INSTAR have observed since 2007. So that's quite a strong signal in the isotopes. This just kind of shows the spatial patterns of these precipitation anomalies in the different phases of ENSO. In the La Nina, we have in blue are positive precipitation anomalies. You can see in the Amazon here these strong positive precipitation anomalies. At a few places in Africa, there are some wetlands in this region here, and certainly in Indonesia too. So during the La Nina phase, we typically see these strong positive anomalies in precip there. Okay, so now I want to switch to the Arctic and talk about what could have been affected there. There are two different processes, at least, that could be affected there. Now, the Arctic is very susceptible to climate feedbacks. The rate of temperature increase there is about 3 times the global average. And as I alluded to before, wetland emissions of methane are very sensitive to soil temperature. This is usually given by an expression like this involving a Q10. Q10 just tells you the factor that emissions increase for 10-degree increase in temperature. And you know, like from kinetics, you might remember that typically for a 10-degree increase in temperature, you get a factor of 2 increase in the rate of a chemical reaction. But for methane emissions from wetlands, the Q10 value ranges from 2 to like 15, but a typical value that people see is on the order of 7. So wetland emissions are very, very sensitive to temperature changes. The other thing, so we got this warming taking place there. In 2007, as you know, was a very warm year in the Arctic. It was also very wet. The other thing we have is about 1,000 petagrams of carbon in the top 3 meters of permafrost soils. Then also as permafrost melts, you get larger wetland area, at least initially. Over longer periods that may drain and it may become a source of CO2. And then it releases labile carbon to produce methane as well. And then the one you hear a lot about is the potential impact of hydrates on the shallow bottom of the Arctic Ocean. It's only about 40 meters deep. The estimates of the amount of methane there is on the order of 30 to 170 petagrams of methane, so quite a bit of methane stored there. And again, we can look at what our observations are telling us were happening around this period. In 2007, this is from the GISS temperature anomalies. In 2007, you can see the Arctic was very warm. It was that first year of unprecedented sea ice loss. It was very wet, too. And when we look at the data, if you look at alert here, you can see from 2006 to 2007, an increase of about 15 ppb at the summer minimum there, but then staying flat after that. And that's a pattern we see throughout the Arctic. No big increase in 2007, but virtually no increase in 2008. For the C13, it sort of chugs along like this, and then all of a sudden we see a change of about 0.15 per mil there. So if you calculate what the delta C13 of a source, that would produce a 15 ppb change and a 0.15 per mil change in delta C13, it comes out to about minus 66 per mil, which is consistent with a wetland source of methane, and not a hydrate source, as I'll show you in just a moment. In addition, well, maybe I shouldn't say in addition, but in parallel to the observational evidence, there have been some models that have tried to understand, chemical transport model studies, inverse models that have tried to understand what's happening with methane in this period. This is a result from Philippe Bousquet, published in ACP in 2010. And here are flux anomalies from two different models, one shown in blue and one in red. These are just different model setups that is used. The details aren't important here. And it's broken down by global, tropical, mid-latitudes of the northern hemisphere and high latitudes of the northern hemisphere. So starting in 2007, along here, we can see that these two models, inversion 1 and inversion 2, give very comparable results. And inversion 1, which is able to resolve different sources of methane, suggests that it's almost entirely a wetland source in the tropics responsible for the global change. But in 2007, there was an Arctic signal too on the order of about 4 teragrams of the total here. And both models agree again. And this is consistent with the tropical wetland vertical profiles from the Amazon and also with the change in delta C13 at alert that we observed. But then in 2008, I mean, one model's going in one direction. Well, I mean, they both have a positive anomaly. But when you get into the tropical region here, the anomaly is very small. One model's putting most of the change in the mid-latitudes of the northern hemisphere, and the other one seems a bit confused about how much of a change there was at all. So 2008, these inversions are done by the same person are inconsistent with each other. But looking at those spatial patterns in the growth rate, it seems to me like it's still something happening in the tropics, probably due to tropical wetlands. And then again, we see this recovery of the high northern latitudes in 2008 here, as I mentioned before. Now, in our group, Laurie Breweiler has an inversion or assimilation system called Carbon Tracker Methane, and its results, at least for 2007, are consistent with Bousquet. This seems to be a pretty reliable, robust result. 2008 seems to be a bit less clear. Okay, so in 2008, the International Polar Year put a lot of focus on things that were happening in the Arctic. And around the same time, there were a couple papers that came out saying that there were huge increases in methane emissions from permafrost and from hydrates in the Arctic. And these are just some quotes, that I sort of saved at the time for occasions like this, so you can have a laugh. And even though this started in 2008, it's something that's this type of sensationalism is something that's continuing today. And what's happening is people are measuring, enhanced emissions from the permafrost or something that they think might be coming from hydrates, extrapolating that to a very large area and coming up with huge fluxes and huge changes in fluxes. In part, it's because they just went out there and started measuring these things. So here's an example of something recent. This is something that appeared on a British blog in earlier this year. And the plot on the left, I'm sure you're familiar with. This is from the Snow and Ice Data Center here in Boulder, and it shows percent sea ice loss. And that's this area in here where there's like complete sea ice loss. And then this guy, Leonid Yurganov, works with AIR's methane, and he laid on top of this methane mole fractions. This is for the mid-troposphere, determined from a thermal imaging satellite sensor. And it lines up almost perfectly where you have this very, or complete sea ice loss by September or something, last year. And he's saying that these are emissions from clathrates, affecting the Arctic. And the fact that we're seeing it only where there's open water has to do with the fact that the methane can't permeate through the ice here. I think this is just complete nonsense. I mean, a satellite sensor like AIR's is very sensitive to the contrast in temperature between the surface and the mid-troposphere. But even if you don't know anything about how satellite sensors work, and you know just a tiny bit about atmospheric transport, which is all I'll admit to know, that this pattern doesn't look right. The fact that you're seeing these high levels of methane, say on the order of 60 ppb greater than what we're seeing over ice at mid to upper troposphere, and there's no horizontal mixing of this, just doesn't make any sense either. And I tried to tell him this at AGU, but he just won't listen. But as it turns out, there were actually some good measurements that were happening in the Arctic in 2008. Rebecca Fisher from Royal Holloway University happened to be on a cruise. There's a paper by Westbrook et al. That describes a cruise off the coast of Spitsbergen where they see bubbles of methane coming from the sediment rising to within, say, 50 meters or so of the surface. And they actually took canisters on the ship, and they had samples collected on shore, too, at Zeppelin in Spitsbergen. And then they brought it back, measured the methane mole fraction and the C13 in methane to try to figure out what is the isotopic signature of the enhancements that they're seeing in those samples. And this is what's called a Keeling plot. It's the methane delta C13 versus 1 over the methane mole fraction here. And the intercept of this plot tells you what the C13 of the source is, and they get minus 65 per mil. Very similar to what we got from our very simple analysis at ALERT, which is consistent with the wetland source. Hydrates, when they're emitted at the surface, are about minus 53 per mil. As they propagate through the water column, they're going to be partially oxidized, which is going to enrich them. The C12 methane is going to go a little bit faster than the C13. So what's actually emitted would be heavier than this. And so it's pretty clear that what they were seeing in 2008 was not from hydrates. Okay, so just 2 more things to go. This is just another way from our data of looking at looking at what's happening in the Arctic. This is that interpolar difference. Again, here's this transition at the time of the economic collapse in the former Soviet Union. If there had been a big increase in methane emissions in the Arctic in the last 4 or 5 years, we would definitely see it in this plot here. And you can see that it's still trending downward. In fact, we have not even recovered to the level we were pre-1992 when the economy of the former Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, I think this is pretty strong evidence that there isn't a big change happening in the Arctic yet. So just to conclude this last part, since 2007, we see methane increasing globally at about 6 ppb per year from 2007 through 2012. The causes of the increase, I think, are wetlands, and this is in response to much warmer than normal temperatures in the Arctic. It was also wet in 2007, but it was only that 1 year. But in the tropics, these persistent precipitation anomalies have led to increased wetland emissions. And I would say that the Arctic is not at a tipping point yet. Since 2008, the Arctic methane has been increasing at about the average global rate. And I'm pretty sure from the IPD, that's indicating that emissions there have not yet increased. But these are just my views on this. And I sent this contour plot to my colleague, Carl Brennickmeyer, a while back to see if he had any ideas of what's happening. He said, Ed, yes, I think I know what's going on. And he sent me this here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ed. Do we have any questions? Or are we all... Do we know everything about methane now? Bill.
This increase from 83 to 2006, it was the increase from 83 to 2006, it was saturating the system or something. You were going to come to an equilibrium. Why wasn't the system in equilibrium already in 1983?
Because, well, what probably happened were emissions were increasing through the 60s and 70s. When I've looked more closely at this using like a combination of FERN data and archive air data, it looked like the transition was around the mid-1970s. And actually that coincides with something important. That's when in the Middle East they started to develop infrastructure to capture gas that had been vented and flagged, gas that was coming out with petroleum. Up until that point it had been vented and flagged, and that's when they were able to start capturing and getting it to market. And that's around the time, I think, the mid to late 1970s, when emissions stabilized. Now, when I say total global emissions are constant, that doesn't mean all sources are constant. Clearly, you have the interannual variability, but there are probably some sources that are going up, like fossil fuel emissions as Asian economies grow, and other sources that are going, emissions are going down due to methane capture and use for energy sources, and changes in rice agricultural practices in Asia, where they used to use rice straw as fertilizer. Now they use inorganic fertilizers. They've changed their the way they use water in rice fields so they don't leave them flooded so long. So there are probably a number of sources that have increasing emissions and some that have decreasing emissions, and the net effect, which sounds amazing that it would just kind of balance out like that, but the net effect, if you assume that the lifetime's been constant, is more or less constant emissions.
Okay.
Just following on from that, with such a clear indication of the collapse of the Soviet Union, why isn't there a compensating effect from an increase of potential emissions from Asia?
I think there is. It's a hard signal to extract. Emissions in the Arctic, are constrained better because there's much less vertical mixing. We have, I think, 8 sites in the Arctic. We're able to get a fairly robust signal there. Now, when I look at changes between mid-latitudes of the northern hemisphere and the high southern hemisphere, I do see some changes there too, but they're more subtle. The uncertainty is a lot larger. The variability is larger, and it's just not clear to me that we can actually see that. It's not a very robust signal, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But this is something I forgot to point out earlier that I meant to. And in addition to the calculation of emissions from our observations, I also show on here EDGAR plus a fixed amount of natural emissions, the same amount in each year. So I'm not trying to account for interannual variability in natural emissions, but just keeping the total fixed. So this is from EDGAR 4.0, which went through 2005. Now I know there's like a 4.2 that goes through 2008, but there's some weird things, like some of these values in here jump up and they're really high. So what I've done is I've used the 4.0, and then I've just sort of, as an approximation, I've done an extrapolation of EDGAR based on that BP statistical review of world energy and increasing fossil fuel usage. And that's how I'm able to extend this curve here. But you can see the way I've extended it here, the slope's actually much less than what they have in EDGAR. And you don't have to do any sort of statistical analysis on this at all. You can see that the trends in EDGAR are certainly not consistent with what the observations are telling us. And the only way that can be is if EDGAR is wrong or if the lifetime is changing quite dramatically. And we have other traces, I think, that would tell us that.
I'll say it again, you think EDGAR is way overestimating the recent?
Yeah, I think some of their emission factors, well, there could be a number of things that are happening. Like either the emission factors are changing over time and they're not accounting for that. I mean, I know they didn't I know they don't account for changing emission factors in the former Soviet Union from the centrally planned economy days to the market economy days now, which could be a big, a big mistake. And as far as what's happening in Asia, I'm not sure where their emission factors come from. I mean, there's just a couple people working on EDGAR trying to develop these inventories for a number of different species and stuff, and there are a lot of demands on them. So I'm not faulting them, but I think we have a pretty good indication of what total global emissions are without an inventory this way.
I think what I heard one time before was that that drop in at the collapse of the Soviet Union was because of inefficiencies or a very leaky energy sector. And when a market economy comes in and people started paying attention, they really tightened that up. Is there truth in that?
I don't think there were a couple of papers that dealt with that, but the problem is in the West we have very little knowledge about what happened in the centrally planned economy days, and so it's just there's some anecdotal evidence that indicates that, but it's not quite clear. Like I talked to one Russian scientist who told me that the leakiest pipelines were just completely shut down when their economies collapsed there, and these are the ones you hear about that a train goes by, it produces a spark, and whole towns are incinerated, and that sort of thing. So,
do we think that the constant lifetime is that a valid assumption?
Yes, I do. What I'm saying is there's no trend in OH. There is some variability from year to year, but in AR4, when they assessed OH, they decided there was no long-term trend in OH, and I don't think there's anything to change that since AR4 came out in 2007.
So the constant emissions doesn't imply constant use of fossil fuels, particularly of methane. What it means is that the pure methane leaking into the atmosphere is relatively constant, or getting into the atmosphere. But like in the former Soviet Union, if you clean up the pipelines, you can be producing more methane, but you're just burning
You're producing more natural gas.
So you're producing more CO2, but you're leaking less methane.
Yeah.
So there's still increases in carbon emissions. It's just not occurring in the atmosphere as methane. Is that right?
Okay. That's right.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. So let's thank our speaker one more time. And